Hello friends, welcome to UGC PG Pathshala. I am Dr. Lubna Siddiqui, Assistant Professor, Department of Geography, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Today I am going to discuss about the module Disaster Linked Financial Strategies, which comes under the paper Disaster Management. The rationale behind this module is mainstreaming disaster risk reduction with developmental interventions require coherent contextual investment in a strategic way that helps address current and future risk of disasters. Effective coordination between and involvement of the local, state and national government and other donor agencies is significant for ex ante, that is prior to disaster event, and ex post, that is post disaster event, investment in disaster risk reduction. The learning objectives of this module are to develop an understanding about the economic impacts of disasters and the rationale behind the necessity for investment in various stages in disaster management, to examine how the economics of disaster management and funding mechanism can be effective at various stages of disaster management, to acquaint with the institutional mechanisms of disaster management funding in India, to understand about the global best practices for financing different stages of disaster management. Now the first part is dealing with economic impact of disasters. Disasters in any economy increase scarcity by reducing the inputs necessary for output. Fewer inputs result in lesser output, thus disasters usually result in a reduction in the total production of a nation. Production possibilities frontier, that is shown in figure 1, illustrates the condition in a nation's economy when it is most efficiently managing its resources to produce goods and services. Points A, B, C on the curve are all efficient allocation of the nation's resources to produce two resources, whereas point X represents an underutilization of the resources, while point Y represents a state not practically possible for the nation given its current set of resources, as it is supposedly produced more than what it can actually produce. An economy operating on PPF is said to be efficient if it is impossible to produce more of one resource without decreasing the output of another resource. Disaster events shift this balance. For instance, drought reduced the agricultural output and significantly altered the prices of produce, thereby affecting the resources available for consumption as well as for the production. Cyclones, earthquakes, floods, etc. could cause harm to the manufacturing bases, that is agriculture farms, manufacturing units, roads and infrastructure, and thereby alter the output. Pandemics like dengue, swine flu, Ebola, etc. affect the labor-intensive production due to its impact on the health of human capital. Thus, disasters expose the dependence of economy on the capital or on labor. Any effect on the labor and or capital would require significant aid and investment into the economy to at least recover to a state it was prior to the disaster. Disaster events generally result in a reduction in productive capacity of the affected nation, reducing welfare and consumption. Without significant savings or access to finance options, variations in wealth, income results in consumption volatility. The following figure, that is figure 2, shows the total damages due to disaster events in India from 2005 to 2016. A trend line shows the increase in economic damages due to the occurrence of disasters. The above economic damages recorded by CRED in MDAT database measures only direct damage to houses, infrastructure. The damages do not include the value of lives lost and indirect cost due to social disruption. How does the local government lose revenue post-disaster? In any post-disaster event, the local government faces the following challenges in resumption of functioning, that is settled to 1985. Number 1, loss of tax base. Tax is a major income to the local government. The destruction of tax base due to any disaster event with resultant damage to property renders local government unable to recover without outside support. Number 2. Loss of business. Livelihoods are affected and the ability of individuals, households and enterprises to consume are affected either due to the impact on supply or on the demand side. Due to decreased consumptions, indirect excess revenue is substantially reduced. Number 3. Changes in debt ratio or the amount of money government has borrowed in relationship to taxable property. Due to overwhelming of local government's capacity to respond and recover, the local government would need to rely on external borrowings which would increase its debt ratio. A community with flourishing revenue-producing industries such as oil refineries and industries generates significant tax revenue and thereby corresponding cash reserves that could be utilized for emergency response or recovery. But a community with a smaller revenue base would find it difficult to raise funds post-disaster and would have to seek state or central government's intervention. It is also observed that there is a convergence of material, that is relief materials, aid workers and money towards relief in a disaster-struck area. Such a convergence of activity would lead to an impression of economic activity post-disasters. Broken window fallacy must therefore be avoided. Broken window fallacy. A window is broken by a small boy while playing cricket. A repairman comes to repair the window if the cost of repair is Rs 300. The visible economic activity in this event is that the repairman's day has been made by the event and associated earning. But the person who spent that Rs 300 cannot spend it on anything else. The boy's father who spent the money might have thought about purchasing a new pair of shoes for the boy. Thereby, a positive to the glass industry ends up as a loss to the shoe industry. Thus, during disasters, society loses value of object unnecessarily destroyed. Post-disasters, when there is a flurry of relief material and labor for the repair and rebuilding activities, an impression of a booming economy is created. A careful study into the necessity of this activity would add validity to this belief. Destroying certain things and recreating does not necessarily mean productive employment or utilization of resources. The occurrence, that is location, scale and distribution of disasters are uncertain, but the government and individuals presume certain expectations of disastrous loss events and act on those expectations. Forbes and Krishner, 2010. Due to the resource crunch post-disasters and the corresponding national losses, it becomes imperative for the nation to focus on national strategies at various stages of disaster management. Better focus on development pre-disaster events generally reduces the necessity and extent for response or relief resources. Better resource management during the relief and rehabilitation phases of disaster management supports long-term development. FAN 2013. The Rio +20 conference renewed mandate to nations by stressing on the importance of stronger interlinkages between DRR, recovery and long-term development planning, calling for coordinated strategies that comprehensively integrate disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation into public and private investment. Voorhees, 2012. Individuals' response to disasters. Each individual has his or her own way of managing situations during adverse situations and maintaining their living standards even during disastrous events. These decisions include their choice of housing materials, location of residence, choice of occupation, that is formal or informal, etc. It could also include social support institutions like family, friends, etc., or availing loans or advances from financial lending institutions during tough times. Others could simply save for bad times or rely on insurance. These steps are taken during the good times rather than during or after disaster events. Post-disaster opportunities for such measures might be severely restricted. Loss of human and non-human capital reduces potential future income and ability of survivors to obtain credit. Forbes and Krishner 2010. It has been observed that household savings are higher in countries with greater disaster risk exposure and higher frequency of disaster events. Public policy for disaster management. A successful disaster policy is the one taken prior, that is ex ante, rather than post materialization of the disaster risk, that is ex post. During post disaster events, government may be in a position to redistribute amongst the affected by borrowing. Due to its taxation power, government is in a better position to allocate resources than relying on private aid credit post-disasters. In developing nations, an effective disaster policy is essential. Economic growth is observed to have increased disaster risk due to the changing micro-behavior by changing the aggregate exposure to disaster risk. Kallenberg and Mubarak 2008. It is significant to note that the economic growth and environmental quality are also related to each other. For example, the increased level of exposure in the Indonesian coast to the 2004 tsunami could be due to the trade-off between growth and environmental protection. Mangrove forests were converted to shrimp farms and tourist resorts, which raised standard of living and commerce, but the natural production of mangroves from tsunami threats was hampered. The conversion of forest land to agricultural land has also increased the risk of exposure to landslides and floods. Therefore, disaster financing and development plans must be complementary to each other. Local governments have the following ways to fund for disaster response and recovery. Settle 1985. Funds transfer, that is general or specific, from a different portfolio to disaster management. For example, a transfer of irrigation funds towards integrated water resource management. Contingency funds or disaster reserves about 3.7% of jurisdictions' total revenue creation of such budgetary allocations to fund during contingencies. Increase in tax rate to replace long-term reserves as recovery investment depletes reserves. Specialized funds like library funds, state gas tax funds, motor vehicles registration funds, mutual aid agreements with other local governments to aid during and post-disaster events. Tax anticipation notes used to fund for current investment in anticipation of tax received in a future date. Municipal bonds or debt security issued by local administration to finance certain planned investment. Insurance program. For example, in the US, the National Floods Insurance Programs 1968, which identifies flood-prone areas, subsidized flood insurance to property owners in these areas, while floodplain regulations were a responsibility of the local government. Assessment districts, for example, Los Angeles County Flood Control District, where redevelopment agencies are formed that acquire property in hazardous areas or damaged property and sell it to private developers to reconstruct entire area. This is best suited for city business districts. Lease purchase agreement could be formulated where private development on public demand is promoted with some public use of private facility which would return to government ownership after a specific period of time. Other administrative suggestions for the local government include listing of all property and facilities under jurisdiction with estimated values and a depreciation schedule. Fee structure, water tax, service tax must include component of replacement cost, as well as operation and maintenance funding and must have a fixed asset system amortized. This would enable the government to better appropriate replacement cost. Developing nation needs to be proactive in controlling rate form of urbanization, thereby having plans in place for disaster and development. Goal of poverty elimination and DRR are complementary. Development investment may lower disaster risk exposure due to the quality of institutions, education, healthcare access and quality. The capacity of less developed nations to respond to any disaster risk and to deliver essential services may be overwhelmed due to inadequate housing, congestion, and thereby the exposure might actually increase. Thus, an inverted U relationship between development and disaster risk exists for disaster events as shown in figure 3 like floods, landslides, wind storms. Disaster deaths increase with increase in income and then decrease. Kallenberg and Mubarak 2008. Challenges for government on ex-ante disaster budgeting. If individuals or households do not save enough or to take on too much risk of exposure to disasters or invest little on mitigating disaster effects, government could increase investment ex ante by increasing taxes and reducing public consumption expenses before the occurrence of events to help funding the cost of relief and recovery. Major obstacles to ex ante investment are, according to Forbes and Krishner 2010, are as under. Political incentives to postpone spending till the occurrence of disaster event. Urgent unmet needs are always posing threats, especially in developing nations. It would thus appear wasteful on the part of decision makers to spend on mitigation or preparedness or response for a potential threat rather than on issues that require urgent attention like housing, sanitation, drinking water supply, electricity, etc. Further, there are political rewards for quick relief. Moral hazard. Availability of insurance or other financial assistance post disasters weaken incentives to invest in the avoidance of losses. National policy for assisting victims post disasters increases the risk of building structures in areas of increased exposure to disaster risk and diminishing motivation for individuals to invest on insurance. Thus, disaster-linked financial strategies must include the buy-in from the at-risk individuals to invest in and have financial interest in investing on disaster risk reduction. Some measures to counter moral hazard are the assignment of first losses to insured and later to the non-insured, capping benefits per claim, levying risk-based premiums, specifying eligibility conditions for assistance based on location, type of construction, owner-provided mitigation measures, lending for recovery vis-a-vis grants. Dynamic inconsistencies change in preference over time of policy makers. Taxpayers might believe that policy makers will enact ex-ante budgeting, raise taxes currently to pay for probable losses in future, only to reverse the policy later and spend the revenues for other purposes. Mechanisms must ensure funds for relief or preparedness or mitigation are used for their specified purposes only and not on opportunistic spending by policy makers. There are examples worldwide that have made possible such mechanism, such as Belgium Standing Fund, Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Fund, EU Solidarity Fund, New Zealand Earthquake Commission Fund, Japanese Earthquake Reinsurance Company. Ostensible impossibility of savings for disasters by government. Savings for disaster events are most efficient if they are incorporated in the budget and not independent of the national budget. Ex ante budgeting for disaster events must be a complement to fiscal policy rather than function as a substitute. Current trends in disaster-linked financial strategies. It is observed that most of disaster spending occurs in the emergency response phase, roughly 66%, followed by reconstruction or rehabilitation in the recovery phase, that is 22%, and the least in mitigation efforts towards reduction of disaster risk prior to the disaster event, as shown in figure 4, that is spending on disaster management. If flood risk reduction measures are undertaken in a property and if the flood risk does not manifest during the lifetime of that building, then would the investment on mitigation of flood risk be considered worthwhile? Recent studies suggest that investment on disaster risk mitigation builds resilience that leads to triple dividend of resilience that yield gains irrespective of hazard manifestation, according to Sormunsky and Turner in 2016. The triple dividends are preventing loss of life and property, attracting investment by lowering the looming threats of losses from disasters, capturing additional development benefits that are often unnoticed. Now, sources of funding. The above mentioned figure 4 shows a detailed description of various sources of funding. The sources are mapped on a linear scale between the resource mobilization and the donor's understanding of the local needs. The funding sources include international funding, national allocation to local governments, and individual contribution towards disaster management. Figure 5 shows the sources of funding for disaster management according to Smith 2011. The variety of funding sources and donors' understanding of local needs thus require sound financial strategies for disaster management to effectively utilize the funds and bring about the disaster risk reduction. Media coverage is a key factor that directs inflow of funds. In the aftermath of Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, it was observed that the event generated extensive media coverage, which resulted in the substantial level of short-term international assistance. About 92 nations pledged financial assistance, with the 3 largest donors, that is US, Australia, Germany, providing nearly 1/6, that is 16.5% of $13.5 million pledged. A World Bank report records that during Cold War period, every article in New York Times covering a disaster correlated roughly with $1.76 million increase in aid. However, following Indian Ocean tsunami, this correlation was roughly $3.1 million per article, according to Litukas and Burnshaw 2008. Insurance as a tool for disaster risk funding. Funding for disasters face one major hurdle in the realization of outlays towards humanitarian assistance. Disaster aid is usually about 10% of the total disaster losses. Leneruth, Bear, Mekel and Plough 2005. 2 years post the 2001 Bhuj earthquake, assistance from Central Reserve Fund and international sources had only reached 20% of the total fund committed. Donor communities, including financial institutions, international agencies, non-governmental organizations and donor governments, are recognizing the need to focus more on prevention of disaster losses. Government bodies, households and enterprises, especially SME in poor countries or developing nations, cannot easily afford commercial insurance to cover disaster risk. Low-cost micro-insurance for independent risk like funeral expenses are widely available in India. Bangladesh, etc., but not the case with dependent risk that affect many communities at the same time. Cost of catastrophic insurance for low probability high cost events is higher than pure risk premium, as the former involves the insurer's cost of backup capital to cover dependent claims. This explains the reason why households in low and middle income countries stay away from insuring, especially for catastrophic insurance. Thus, the donor community could focus on disaster assistance to risk management programs that leverage aid through public and private contributions and that promotes loss mitigation. Following examples illustrate the utilization of insurance as an effective tool for disaster risk financing. Turkish Catastrophe Insurance Pool. It tackles insurance affordability in a middle-income developing nation. Istanbul faces a 0.41 probability of severe earthquake in 2004 to 2034 period. In response to the earthquake risk, earthquake insurance policy is mandated as per law for all property owners. The owners pay a risk-based fee to a privately administered public fund. In order to reduce the premium, World Bank produces backup capital for two layers of risk as a loan and in the form of a contingent fund. Ethiopia index-based weather derivative drought in Ethiopia was severe in the year 1984. To manage increasing occurrence of weather-based disaster risk, an index-based weather derivative was set up. The derivative is a contingent contract with a payoff determined by future weather events such as a specific lack of precipitation measured at weather station. Thus, farmers could reduce their losses by diversification and yet get benefits due to the physicality of the hazard. The affordability of the scheme was ensured by World Food Programme by convincing donors to subsidize premiums or by providing backup capital to reduce the risk of drought. Challenges in insurance as a tool for disaster risk reduction. The science associated with insurance models must be transparent, independent, and viewed as reliable by insurers, investors, and donors. There still exist large uncertainties, especially with longer-term risk and the reluctance of private sector to enter the risk transfer market. Promotion of good governance and sound regulatory policies would help in more investors for insuring on catastrophes. Refocusing of disaster aid is not to replace with unaffordable private insurance, but to act as a complement to post-disaster humanitarian aid with pre-disaster support of risk management. Now, sources of disaster risk funding in India. The following funds are set up for disaster risk financing in India. National Disaster Response Fund, that is NDRF. The Section 46 of the Disaster Management Act 2005 says that NDRF is to be utilized for meeting the requirement for emergency response, relief and rehabilitation due to any threatening disaster situation or disaster. The NDRF shall be used for severe nature of the following nationally notified disasters such as cyclones, drought, earthquake, fire, flood, tsunami, hailstorm, landslide, avalanches, cloudburst, pest attack, and cold wave frost. The NDRF was previously called the National Calamity Contingency Fund, that is NCCF. The National Executive Committee of the National Disaster Management Authority is entrusted with the responsibility of taking decision on expenses from NDRF as per guidelines issued on 8 April 2015. The NDRF is financed through levy of cess on items approved through the finance bill passed every year. Any requirement over and above the NDRF is met through general budgetary allocation. Now, second one is State Disaster Response Fund, that is SDRF. Under Section 48 of the Disaster Management Act 2005, the SDRF is to be utilized for meeting the requirement of emergency response, relief and rehabilitation for the 12 nationally notified disasters as well as towards relief for victims of state-specific disasters. States shall utilize SDRF as the primary source of funding for response and rehabilitation in emergencies of severe nature, and if the funds are found to be short of requirement, the states could seek assistance from NDRF. The SDRF or NDRF is provisioned for relief and not towards compensation of losses or damages. The source of SDRF funds for the states is grant recommended by the erstwhile Finance Commission under Article 275(1) of the Constitution, Government of India. Contributes 75% of SDRF to general category states and 90% of SDRF to special category states, that is 11 states, the 7 northeastern states, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand as non-plan grant in 2 installments every year. National Cyclone Risk Mitigation Project. About 75% of the Indian coastlines are highly vulnerable to the impacts of tropical cyclones and related hydrometeorological hazards. Government of India has initiated NCRMP with a view to address the vulnerability to cyclones. The objective of the project is to undertake contextual and suitable structural and non-structural measures to mitigate the effects of cyclones in the coastal states and union territories of India. The project identified 13 cyclone-prone states and UTs and categorized into Category 1, higher vulnerability states or union territories, Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Odisha, Tamil Nadu and West Bengal. Under Category 2, lower vulnerability states and union territories, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Kerala, Goa, Puducherry, Lakshadweep, Daman and Diu, Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The focus of the project is towards improving early warning dissemination systems, enhancing the adaptive capacity and response capacity of local communities, improving access to emergency shelters, evacuation and protection from windstorms, floods and storm surges, and strengthening disaster risk management at central, state and local levels in order to mainstream disaster risk mitigation into development agenda. Financing for the project is through Department of Economic Affairs, Government of India, World Bank and the state governments. Funding is through centrally sponsored scheme supported by World Bank's Adaptable Program Loan NCRMP. The National Disaster Mitigation Fund was directed to be set up under the directive of the Disaster Management Act 2005. The objective of this fund is to provide financial support aimed at mitigation or disaster risk reduction, which is being served by existing centrally sponsored schemes or central sectoral schemes such as the Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana, Krishna Jyoti Yojana, National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture, that is Manrega, major irrigation projects, Mamami Gange in National Ganga Plan, River Basin Management, National River Conservation Plan and Water Resource Management. Additionally, the Ministry of Finance has made provision of 10% of total outlay for all CSS schemes as Flexi Fund, Ministry of Home Affairs 2016. Insurance under the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, that is PMFBY, provides insurance coverage and financial support to farmers in the event of failure to notified crops as a result of natural calamities, pests and diseases, and ensures flow of credit to agriculture sector, Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. India's Companies Act mandated enterprises with a net worth of Indian rupees 500 crore or more, or turnover of Indian rupees 1000 crore, or net profit of Indian rupees 5 crore or more in India, to assess and take responsibility for the company's effect on the environment and the impact on social welfare. Such organizations were mandated to invest 2% of the amount of net profit for the last 3 financial years in development functions or addressing vulnerabilities or building capacity for responding to stress, including disasters. Now, summary. Financial strategies for disaster risk reduction requires comprehensive and coherent strategies in both ex ante and ex post investment. The government is in a better position to invest on disaster management than private investment. The investment in DRR ex ante must be parallel to development agenda with greater collaboration between multiple actors. Ex post investment must be channelized towards greater resilience and capacity building and must be utilized to address the gaps. Contextual strategies suiting the country's specific needs, addressing vulnerabilities and local requirements would help reduce fiscal impacts of disaster events. I hope you have understood the concept of disaster linked financial strategies. See you next time. Thank you.